one of the things I think is symptomatic of a kind of blockage in thinking is when the language starts to feel like it's not really doing the work. And so we talk about capitalism, but then we keep putting modifiers on the front of it. So, and the latest is to call it neoliberal capitalism. So it's like, wait a minute, you're using a modifier that itself also has a modifier on it, which just seems to me to be bad poetry. What if this isn't actually even capitalism anymore? It's something worse that superseded it. History moved on. All that is solid melts into air, all that is sacred is profane. Like Marx had this very, very dynamic sense of what had been ushered in by capitalism, but somehow we then treat it as if it's an essence that's eternal, that goes on for all time, and only changes in appearances. And I want to question that sort of metaphysics in how we think, which really is a space shared by the left and the right. Like everybody seems to agree at the moment that this is capitalism. It's just whether you hate it or love it. So I want to question that shared assumption and ask, maybe it's not even capitalism anymore, it's something worse. Then what would be a new language that describes new forms of exploitation, new forms of oppression, new forms of asymmetry, and how would we begin to do that work? What if those who produce information are not workers? I call them hackers, and it's a word that maybe didn't date that well, so call it what you like. But let's think of different ways of describing what it means to be someone who produces information but doesn't own or control it, because that's what most people I know do in a metropolitan city. Yeah, that's what most labor is that isn't maintenance and service work. So well, then who ends up owning and controlling all that information? So I called that ruling class the vectoralist class, in the sense that it's ownership and control of the vector of information. Its storage, its logistics, its brands, its copyrights. You don't need to own the means of production anymore to be a ruling class, and that strikes me as really quite particular. A vector is just a line of fixed length, but any position at all, so it has this sense of a technical specificity that you can deploy in lots of different ways. So that struck me as sort of a useful metaphor for thinking about how you can control a specific thing, but then thread any resources on the planet anywhere together through logistical chains of information. So Apple Corporation doesn't make phones, like it doesn't. That's all made by outsourced to firms elsewhere. So what does it mean to be able to control through the vector the whole value chain? That seems to me to be the question to ask. One of the main ways, probably the main way that this might be worse than capitalism is vectoralist class as a ruling class is able to treat everything as resources in motion, in a sense tagged and tracked with information threaded into a logistics, so the entire planet becomes nothing but resources, which only accelerates the destruction of the conditions of possibility of human life, or possibly any life. So it's worse in the sense that it's brought us closer to that threshold where either we find a different mode of production altogether, or that's it. So for Marx, capital really is a meat grinder, and it does sort of like mush labor into something like aspic or meat jelly. I don't know if people know what this is anymore, but something kind of disgusting is sort of the product in a way. And that makes sense in the 19th century to kind of think about when labor is hands and the physical labor of workers being mushed together, becoming capital over and against labor, exploiting and controlling. But I live in New York. Most people I see around, apart from service workers, don't work like that. What's being mushed and compressed isn't flesh, it's brains. So to what extent is the extracting of information something a little bit different? And where the labor process is kind of different, the way you commodify it is different. So what if we focused a little bit more specifically on what the brain fryer was, rather than the meat grinder, as a kind of metaphor for something a little bit different to our traditional model of labor, and thought about that as involved also in maybe some relatively new modes of exploitation that have a slightly different quality. One of the things that over the last 30 years has really accelerated is the commodification of information. And you could think about that as the absorbing of information as, something we've really only had a concept of since the 40s. You could think of it as the absorbing of that information into the commodity form. But maybe it also changes the commodity form. And there's different kinds of commodity at work as well. So what does it mean to extract information out of a workforce and then commodify that? And then where's exploitation? So it still exists, but maybe it has more to do with asymmetries of information now. And an example of that would be most people use Google or Bing or something like that. And it seems like you get this little bit of information for free, right? But if you get something for free, it basically means you're the product. Yeah, that's, we've known this in media studies since the broadcast era. So how are you the product? And it's like, well, every little bit of information you get, you're giving all of this information in exchange for it that Google or Apple or whoever gets to own in the aggregate and instrumentalize over and against you. So to what extent is that a different model of exploitation based on information asymmetry? And this is not to say that traditional exploitation of labor has gone away. It hasn't. Exploitation of farmers by landlords hasn't gone away either. So we already have nested modes of production, one inside the other. My proposition is to think about maybe there's a new one on top of all the old ones, and asymmetries of information is how it works. I wanted to bring into the writing of, call it what you like, something like theory, the more experimental and creative approaches to language, because I think Marx was already doing that. He's already very playful with language, and you can kind of lose that when you just read him as a philosopher or a social scientist or whatever. So I was thinking about Pasolini, for example, as someone who's, was able to bring a kind of poetics. So maybe one needs to be kind of exploratory in the space of language as well in order to generate concepts that might explain this particular world that we ended up in. And I was trained by, provincial working class militants who drank too much and smoked too much and swore too much. In a word, they were vulgar. And then I went to university and read New Left Review, and suddenly to be vulgar is a bad thing because we don't want to be vulgar Marxists. But I'm like, do we want to be genteel Marxists? I don't and couldn't. So I kind of wondered if we'd sort of lost the popular sense of what the vulgar might be on two fronts. So to be vulgar Marxist in the cultural sense, to embrace all of the popular energies, maybe not a bad thing, because fascists do that only too well, so let's try to head them off. The other thing is there's a conceptual meaning to being a vulgar Marxist, which is to privilege in your analysis the base over the superstructure. So it's the economic and technical forces driving history rather than the political and ideological superstructures that really matter. And I thought it's time to sort of do that again. I think maybe we've sort of done a little bit too much political theory and a little bit too much cultural theory. And we've not thought enough about the forces of production. So what are the techniques that made all of these things we talk about possible? So what made neoliberalism possible? I think it's what needs to be explained. It's not an explanation. And I think it's the analysis of technics is the piece that's missing. And the thing is, those of us trained in the humanities and social sciences can't really do that work. We need a kind of collaborative labor of understanding that reaches across all of the kinds of work that are involved in making this world to even be able to analyze it. So there's a kind of comradely production of knowledge that's required now, I think, to even understand what's novel and distinctive about the dominant mode of production of the times and how it controls the others. So I'm from a steel and coal town where a strike meant shutting down the port or the railway. So it meant finding a place that you could create a blockage that would shut everything else down. And the fortunes of more vulnerable workers depended on the capacity and the solidarity of workers in those key pivotal points to kind of shut down systems that were not elaborate, that had, very thin networks in a sense. That's really hard to do now. And in essence, I think the whole project of the later 20th century was finding out ways to route around that power of the strike that labour used to hold. And so labour's been on the defensive for quite some time in the, let's just say, overdeveloped world. And at the same time, you've got this rise of the production of information as the very means to do that. I tell a kind of ironic story where capital, in its attempt to outflank labour, draws on new industries and new technologies of communication, but itself gets outflanked by a class that then dominates capital as well through that means. So the thing about that is that then the old strategies of labour are still important, but they're not going to have the same kind of effectivity. So one might need different ideas about what a strike is. I think the kind of notion of shutting down the sphere of social reproduction starts to get more interesting when you sort of think about that. So, and then are there ways of thinking not just about stopping the system itself, but of what I call hacker class, or whatever this kind of information labour is, thinking about the content of what it does as well as shutting down the form of it. And so it's interesting to see the rise of organised tech workers who are asking questions like, why are we building technologies that just enable surveillance and policing and putting people in cages on the Mexican border? Like, why are we involved in those contracts? And given that, you know, you sort of rely as much on sort of seducing information out of labour as you do force in this particular world, then sometimes that has effectivity. To kind of lose that kind of seduction of information workers or hackers into wanting to do it actually may have a little more effectivity than the coercive means through which labour was controlled were able to exert in the past. If you imagine an era of the automation of labour, it tended to leave a little bit untouched the production of information because it had qualitative dimensions to it. But what's been called artificial intelligence is very much about the automation of that. So the production of information can then also be something subject to automation, and then loss of direct control by the people who used to produce it, what I call hacker class. So whether or not we can still retain some sort of agency in relation to that becomes very much the issue of the day. And the problem with the rise of a sort of algorithmic management of information is that it's all based on all of the kind of prejudices and exclusions of the old systems. You just sort of take those as data in and build ways to reproduce exactly the same thing. So, for example, the racist basing of policing in the United States, and I imagine pretty much anywhere else, you take that as data, input it into artificial intelligence and produce exactly the same thing on an expanded scale. So there's a kind of wide spectrum of struggles around the control of information and the attempt, and I think not just to retrieve some sense of agency, but also then to sort of address how the old disciplinary apparatus and the new algorithmic ones have all of the same exclusions and biases built into them. The injuries of work are different for a hacker class producing information than for a working class producing things. So if you're working class producing things, there are a lot of physical dangers usually attached to that. There's a lot of boredom attached to that. There's a kind of wear and tear on the body that's attached to that. But it's a little bit different when you're sort of sitting in a coffee shop with your laptop and like you don't even really quite know what the thing is you're supposed to be working on. You just know you'll be told after you've done it if it was the right thing or not. So there are sort of forms of anxiety that are attached to that. There are forms of depression because of, will I get that next job and can I do all this stuff? There are ways in which you have to be present in social media all the time, which definitely didn't apply to traditional forms of labour. So I think the kind of injuries of this kind of labour are kind of different and specific and really need addressing as things that are social effects of the commodification of information by a ruling class, rather than as, oh, you are depressed, so that's your problem, you should be on this medication, which, by the way, the National Health doesn't even fund anymore, etc., etc. So I think to sort of take back that space of affect and feeling and mental well-being, as well as the physical downside of doing labour with information, is that everybody's got RSI, everybody's got a sore back. So, and not to say it doesn't have physical side effects as well, but that we kind of get caught up in problems that seem like they're mental but are actually social as well. There's usually multiple ruling and subordinate classes at the same time. One can forget that, particularly if you pay a little bit more attention to Marx's Capital and not to the rest of the body of work, because in Capital it's supposed to narrow down to two classes, yeah? But what if there are multiple ruling and subordinate classes with hierarchies internal to those as well? Then we sort of start thinking more the way Gramsci was thinking, or more the way German Social Democrats thought about the peasant question, things like that. So I think that's a useful kind of lens for thinking that, you know, you kind of urban hacker class making information is sort of like not quite the same thing as whatever working class is. And then maybe working class isn't the same thing as this sort of image of man with hammer that we sort of have interpreted from Russian iconography more than anything else, you know, from the Soviet era. So to sort of rethink the composition of those classes and to think them as external and separate to each other, and then in needing of an alliance, like that strikes me as useful. The other side of this is if there's more than one ruling class, then what are the antagonisms and compromises between those ruling classes, and is there agency in trying to find the gap or the difference between them? So I don't think capitalist class and vectoralist class necessarily get along all the time. They have a common interest in maintaining a system of exploitation, but they're also rivals for the surplus. So where is their agency in thinking in a multi-class world rather than trying to fit everything into two boxes, as if this sort of great polarization had ever happened when it sort of didn't?